Welcome to our session on financing landscape. We have a great panel with us this morning. We're running a little bit late, but we'll take the time allocated, so about 45 minutes for this session. We want it to be a little bit different in the way we approach the topic. So I'll give you a few hints to start with on the format of the session. We're going to want to try and make this as interactive as possible, and then I'll introduce our panels, and then we'll get started with the content of the session. So first of all, we'd like you to be able to interact with us during the session, so please make sure you have your mobile phone with you and your Slido app open. You're going to need this in the course of the session. We also are going to have a workshop discussion this afternoon to go into the details of some of the challenges and the solutions that will be talked about during this panel discussion, and all your comments and questions that you'll be posting on Slido will be fed back to that workshop session this afternoon. The final point on format is that we wanted to frame this discussion as a Dolphin tank discussion as opposed to a Shark Tank discussion. So the Dolphin tank approach is really the collaborative, constructive, trusted approach, trusted way of giving feedback and working together to enhance an initial idea or project into something better. So that's the framing of the session as well. So we're looking forward to swimming with you in that sort of a big Dolphin tank. In terms of the content, I have with me five very interesting panelists that have both the landscape perspective. So Paul Chatterton from the Landscape Finance Lab and WWF will give us his vision of setting up landscapes and financing landscapes. And with the help of Jodi, the co-founder of the Earth Agency in Fiji, will present a very specific case, the Fiji Great Sea Reef program. And through that example of the Fiji Great Sea Reef program, we'll talk a little bit more about the challenges that one can face when trying to finance landscape approaches. And to talk about those challenges and give feedback and constructive feedback and workshop solutions, I have with me Renat from the South Pole Group, CEO and founder of South Pole, who's an experienced project developer, project aggregator, and also experienced in blended finance instruments. I also have with me Brom, co-founder and chief investment officer of SailVentures, the boutique investment firm managing the Green Fund, specialized in landscape investments. And Florian Meister from Finance in Motion, one of the leading and largest impact investment managers. So hopefully with those amazing five people with me, we'll have an opportunity to take a deep dive into some of the issues that landscape are facing to access finance. So before I hand over to Paul to give us an introduction of landscape in general and the Fiji case in particular, I just wanted to say a very few words around why are we talking about landscape now, and how does that relate to the transformation that Kirsten talked about and that we've heard about over the last 2 days. Well, really, the scale of change that is required to meet the 1.5 degree scenario and the Agenda 2030 is such that project level action and sectoral action is not going to take us there. On their own, they're not going to take us there. We need to be able to also act at a higher level, at a landscape level, and bring together not only the SMEs and the project developers on the ground, but also the governments through multi-stakeholder platforms to co-design with all those stakeholders systemic change. And so the level of action needs to change. And the speed of action also needs to accelerate, because we, as we heard during the dinner last night, we only have 12 years to fix the system. And the way I think we can frame this in our context so that it resonates really well is to say it's not exactly 12 years, actually. It's 11 more harvests. This is what we have left to change the food and land use system. We have 11 more harvests in front of us to fix the system. And hopefully the discussion we'll have today will shed some light on some of the solutions that can be implemented on the ground to unlock finance at scale for those landscapes. So starting with you, Paul, I think you have a few slides. Would you like to walk us through your vision of landscape level action and specifically give us a little bit more background on what is happening in Fiji or what could happen in Fiji if finance was mobilized?
So thank you, Marion. Hello, everyone. Let me start my slides. If I can. So while we're waiting for those to come on, I work for the largest conservation organisation on Earth. Nope, that's not the ones. You heard last night that we are winning many battles, but we are completely losing the war. We've lost 60% of the animals on Earth in the last 40 years, and we can't solve the problem by using the tools that created it. A sectoral approach and a project approach is what's destroyed this planet. We need to change the game completely, and landscape finance is a way that many conservation organisations, and I think increasingly the rest of the world that deals with land management, is starting to think about a new approach. The land sector, though, I think is missing in many of these conversations. I haven't heard much about it in this conference. You hear a lot about energy, you hear a lot about transport and buildings, but if you look at sources of greenhouse gas emissions, a quarter of them come from the land sector. Nearly a third of solutions could come from forests alone. But only 1% of the money, if you use green bonds as a starting point, 1% of the money is going into the land sector. So we're completely missing the game on the land sector. How do we turn that around, and what's the cause? One of the key causes, I'm told, is that in the land sector, we're not dealing with projects large enough. The largest conservation projects we deal with are in the tens of millions of dollars. A banker doesn't get out of bed in the morning unless you're talking $100 million. That's what they told us at the top of the Rockefeller Center last year when the world's conservation industry met with the finance industry and looked at this question. There is the money out there, but there are not projects structured at the scale that bankers are interested in, $100 million and upwards. So how do we do that? That's the question. Landscapes, we think, is a way of doing that. WWF as an organisation is completely retooling at the moment around landscapes as a solution. They're large, they cover areas of 1 million hectares at least. They're holistic, they bring together action in forests, in agriculture, in water, in energy. They allow people to talk to each other across the sectors. And they're long-term, which allows us to get impact. Because I tell you, I've worked for 30 years in conservation, and the only real long-term change I've seen are places where people have worked for at least a decade to make the change. That's what we have to be able to do. Just a little bit of introduction. There are two ways we think we can create this new product for land management and river management and sea management, as we'll see shortly. At a horizontal scale of integrating activities within a landscape. So linking together forest and agriculture and water activities across a landscape. And we'll see that with Fiji. There's another way of doing it as well, which is dealing with supply chains, purchasing out of landscapes and the financing of those activities in a landscape. But let's go to Fiji. Fiji is a remarkable set of islands. The reefs provide half of the economy of Fiji. The Fijian economy depends on fisheries and tourism and agriculture. So if you lose the reefs, which will happen in the next 30 years, you lose half the economy of Fiji. So that's the challenge we started with. We worked with 15 different organisations, more than 100 people, nearly a couple of hundred people involved in looking at how we could save the reefs and generate a renewable economy, a regenerative economy for Fiji. It was launched at the COP last year with the President of Fiji, and I think it's quite an exciting vision. It shows what's possible in many landscapes. If you're going to deal with fisheries, you need to be thinking about land-based sources of the problem. We can't deal with climate change at the scale of Fiji, but we can deal with the runoff, the siltation that's smothering the reefs. We can deal with the pesticides and the organics that are poisoning the reefs that come from the agriculture. And the good news is that it's quite profitable to do so. There's carbon finance for the forest restoration. Restoring mangroves makes sense to the fisheries people, because that's where the fish breed. Restoring river forest gives you fresh water, but it also stops the sediment going down into the reefs. And the agriculture side of it is actually very profitable, and we'll see that with Jodi. So this program, $115 million is the estimate, could possibly return 5 times that back to the economy of Fiji over the next 10 years. And what's important is that it's creating a vision that everyone can work together around, and which allows them to see the synergies between the fishing industries, the agricultural industries, and the forestry industry. These guys should be best friends rather than strangers. So there's a quick introduction to the Fiji landscape as an example of one of many other landscapes we're working in. And I'll hand over to Jodi to give you more detail.
Thank you, Paul. And just before I hand over to Jodi, I just would like the audience to keep in mind that after Jodi's presentation, you'll be asked whether you would be interested in investing in one of the few investment opportunities that Jodi will present. So listen carefully and make up your mind during the presentation, and be ready to pull up your Slido app just afterwards.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jodi, and for 20 years I worked in the film industry. In fact, just off to the side, beside Keanu, off camera on the floor, I'm sitting there. In this scene, Morpheus is offering Neo a blue pill and a red pill. Red releases Neo out of the Matrix, and blue keeps him in his comfortable life. So 6 years ago, I took a red pill. I went from working on movies, so I spent my days with Keanu, Hugh Jackman, Ryan Reynolds, and I swapped this for a very different reality. So outside of the Matrix, and I mean this quite literally, I became a farmer in Fiji. And I was living and working beside other farmers in Fiji. And exactly how deep did this rabbit hole go? Well, can I ask you, to answer that question, I want to ask you all just for a moment, use your mind's eye and imagine Fiji. What is Fiji to you? Okay, well, this is Fiji. Probably quite different to what you imagined. Fiji's not at war, but it looks like we're at war, and we see these images every day, and I have some friends here with me who live in Fiji as well, and this is our reality. This is natural disasters, this is burning, agricultural burning, this is deforestation and coral bleaching. So I've heard the words community, connectivity, and collective a lot over the last few days, and this is what our community looks like. So our mothers, our fathers, brothers, sisters, cousin sisters, our friends. So one thing that I have seen here, or not seen here, is our community here. And I know this is Europe focused, but we are all in this together. And I would love to see our communities here. So the supply chain in agriculture. this is how it looks in Fiji, and I've heard a lot over the last 2.5 days as well. There's not a lot of investable projects. Paul just mentioned this as well. They're too small. There's not enough. So in the last 2.5 weeks, I have done some research, and I found over 35 companies in agriculture alone. I haven't even touched tourism, fisheries, or forest, water, energy. So with this many businesses, I'm going to give you 3 examples. We're going to drill down now. So the first one, EVCO Pacific. So this is the world's first range of coconut and avocado blended cooking oils. They have pre-sales into the States, into 6,000 supermarkets. There will be 5 plants across the Pacific, and the first one in Fiji will be operational in mid-2019. The full production of this one plant is expected to increase Fiji's current export earnings by 4.5%. And as a part of this, in the first year, they have to certify 6,500 farmers organic. So the ROI on this, so 30% JV shareholding, which is $3.75 million into this company, would bring a $2 million dividend payout in the first year. And then following that, over 3 years, $33.6 million in returns, with $12 million per annum thereafter. The next, Coro Pacific. So we're more local with this one. So this is a retail store and cafe chain focused on chemical and plastic-free natural food and handicraft products sourced from women, and also ready meals and compostable packaging. So this provides a local market for organic sales and women's craft. It gives a validation that women who do most of the work in agriculture are key actors in the sector. And it raises awareness about plastic pollution and nutrition. Despite holding the COP23 presidency, there's still been no ban on plastic bags in Fiji. So Coro requires $2.5 million US for its first 4 stores. The ROI is between 5 and 8%. Next, we have Bulabatiki Association. So this is community-owned. It's a remote island processing facility making multiple retail products, including virgin coconut oil. So to our knowledge, this is the first community-owned island which has organic and ISO food safety certification. The only others in the region that have those certifications are owned by multimillionaires, Mel Gibson, Jim Jannard, who's Oakley Sunglasses, and the guy who owns Red Bull. So the inspirational story here for Fiji is that Fijians can own their own businesses and they can do business on a world stage. In terms of incomes for the families, each family now receives $20 US a day from this work, whereas before doing copra production, it was $6 US a day. And another thing critically is that the young people are not leaving for the cities anymore to look for work. So ROI, some financials around this, $300,000 to add 3 more product lines. Most of this money has been raised. Annual revenues thereafter will be $400,000 US, and a net profit after every family gets paid of $180,000. This sounds very small, but for a community of 300 people, this is significant. So, what do Paul and I need from you? We need systems and business investors who have 3 million euros to help us build a bankable business incubator. So on behalf of Paul, on behalf of the people of Fiji, I'm boldly asking, let's no longer be us and them. Let's all take the red pill together, and let's turn this mess around. Let's use Fiji as the test case for landscapes around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jodi and Paul, for this really inspiring presentation. So we're going to turn back to the audience now and pull up a few questions on Slido. We want to hear from you about those 3 investment opportunities and understand whether, if you were an investor, maybe you are an investor. If you're not, try and picture you in the shoes of an investor. Would you invest in each of the 3, either of the 3 or none of them? So I think we have the questions now up on Slido. can we see the response on the screen there? So in which opportunity would you invest? So the first one, 33% of you would invest in Bula Batiki Association, so not bad. About 30% of you would invest in all of them, 20% in Coro Pacific Farm, and about 16% in EFCO Pacific. So not bad at all. Well done, Jodi, for probably what was one of your first sort of pitch, right?
I don't do this for a living.
I'm now going to turn to our real investors, real-world investors. And I'll start with you, Florian. So first of all, how would you have responded to the question, in which of those investment opportunities would you have invested, if any? And what is most important to you as an investor when you listen to some of the opportunities that Jodi shared? What would be the single most important thing that you would want to see in order for you to be more likely to make an investment decision?
Well, the quick answer is I think I would invest in all of them the way they were presented. Of course, then it's a question of the due diligence, evidencing the data that you show, and also seeing if one can further improve the proposition. Just by brief way of background, Finance in Motion, we come from the financial inclusion space where the origins of our PPP or blended funds are. Because, well, that was at the time a challenge, but feasible. And now we have like 2/3 of our 2 billion in assets in that financial inclusion access for small enterprises, microfinance enterprises to finance space. We then moved on to the climate space where we have about 500 million now in climate assets. And last now, but with urgency, is we're turning toward landscape approaches. And I think, to Paul's point, I think it's a really important but most complex matter to solve because it involves so many parties. It's a holistic question. And I think in your Fiji approach, it's tremendously important that it succeeds. I hope you have relevant, grant facilities behind you or blended finance instruments behind you, because not all of this will produce commercial returns right away. And I think it will be very important also to nurture the ideas at an early stage, have accelerator systems in place for ideas and incubators as a next step, and then projects maybe jointly with venture capitalists to screen the business opportunities. By the way, I have to say that clearly, we don't now have the ability from our existing funds to invest in Fiji. We're geographically limited, unfortunately.
Thanks, Florian. That's really interesting. So what we're hearing here is that yes, willingness to invest in those opportunities is there. What could be helpful is blended finance or other forms of capital to de-risk or help those businesses reach profitability more quickly, and also a sort of acceleration or startup incubation platform to really help those ideas become a truly sustainable business model. So thanks for that. Turning to you, Jodi, because you're really specialized in this field. Sort of landscape investments is the core of SailVentures expertise and of Green investment portfolio. So from your perspective, and with the information that you have at hand, how would you assess the Fiji opportunities? Sort of what criteria or tools or assessment would you make on the opportunity that is at hand?
Yeah, thanks very much. Very interesting opportunities. I'm also SailVentures, and at the moment the fund we manage, Green, is not focused on Fiji, but nonetheless same concepts apply, and we're looking at landscape investments. To be honest, just purely from our approach, probably the EVCO example is the most fitting, and I say that not because it's better, but because I could clearly see in your presentation that they have a link to international markets, and they probably have a strong sponsor behind them, and I'll come back to that. When we're looking at it, all three are very interesting though, and maybe through another intermediary we will be able to access the other two, for example. When we're looking at landscape investments, I think our first we're a long-term investor, so I'm thinking often we look at projects well beyond 7 years, beyond 10 years, We've just come back from a due diligence in Indonesia on a 15-year project. That's essentially equity type risk. In an emerging market, 15 years, there's a number of political cycles. It's a very long time to think about. You think of it very much like equity. So one thing for me when thinking about Fiji, I would ask, what is the comparative advantage of these supply chains? It's a question I would have to some of the products being put forward. If they don't have a strong comparative advantage, I'm talking globally, or maybe in the local market, it's very difficult for me to envision as an investor how 10, 15 years down the line that business will really be able to survive purely because of the externality of the market or the system within which it is might be weak. So that would be a key consideration I would look at. Our investments, we look for market transformation. So we look at these supply chains. How can we make a market? How can we invest in that supply chain and that be a leader to shift the market? So we would be looking not just at the particular project, but the market impact of it. So how would others be able to follow them? All three examples look possible that there could be a leader, if you will, for others to follow. If it's too bespoke and too specific, the market doesn't follow, in my view. If it takes 10 investors, all types of capital, many, 5 years to do the deal, we've seen those in the development finance world, we've seen that often, the market won't follow. So simplicity in that sense makes sense. One thing on the sponsor, for us, that's important, we're doing very high-risk transactions around the world, and these examples would be the same. The strength of the sponsor is critical. One would be skin in the game, so how much money are they putting in? If they don't have a lot, is it in the project or not? We have looked at projects where the sponsor tells us they don't have any, they have nothing to put forward, but what they have is not in the project, and that's difficult to believe in their long-term success. So we look for their skin in the game, and also whether we're aligned in terms of results long-term. And that's a triple bottom line impact. In these kind of examples, the economics strengthen, in our view, we're looking for projects where the economics strengthen the environmental and social impact. It becomes for us, that's the sweet spot, and all three of the examples you gave could be examples of that.
Thanks, Jodi. That's really interesting. Just two very quick, hopefully brief follow-on questions for you before I come to you, Renat. So do you have any limitations or requirements in terms of size? Can you do any size, or how does that come into your investment decision? And then second question, how do you make the link as an investor between the investment opportunity that you're assessing on the ground and the level of sustainability of the landscape in which it is supposed to operate? Because investing in sustainable landscape is one of your primary criteria. So how do you assess that? And at what point in the investment process?
But maybe on the first one, yes, we have a natural limitation on size, and I'm sure Florian would agree. I mean, so our fund at the moment is 120 million. Our target is about 400 or 500. It's very difficult to deploy that kind of capital over a period of years if you're looking at very small transactions. So that's number one. Number two, on the size, the point of the fund we manage is market transformation. So it's focusing on shifting these supply chains, delinking them from deforestation, essentially delinking them from their climate change impact. In our view, that requires larger investments in order to influence these markets. Typically, the supply chains we look at, soy, cattle, palm oil, they're sizable supply chains. A smaller transaction is not as relevant in that supply chain. In the case of virgin coconut oil, it might be different. We might be able to make the case for a much smaller investment would have the same sort of supply chain impact. So we could look at something smaller. But typically our project sizes total project would be more than 20 million. On your second question, how do we incorporate the landscape thinking? Because at the end of the day, we would have an investment contract with the client, not with the whole landscape. But we essentially assess the viability and the robustness of the climate change impact we're trying to generate by what's happening in the landscape and by the role the client is playing in that landscape. So we more look at it from the point of view of our relationship is with the client, the company on the ground, but are they part of the ecosystem around them? Is there an ecosystem around them? And that's where our relationships with NGOs, with government are very relevant because it actually decreases our risk. Not just economic risk, I mean, our KPI risk, if there are other actors supporting, working with the company, and the company is open to do that. In many landscapes, the company will not actually engage government or NGOs or even their competitors. So we more assess it in terms of a risk management of the landscape.
Thanks, Johnny. And I really wanted to have those two questions before I turn to you, Renat, because the question on size is particularly important to you. As an experienced project developer in the carbon space, you have been designing and implementing projects on the ground for a number of years now. What advice could you give to Jodi in structuring her investment opportunities? What can she do to possibly bundle some small opportunities into a bigger one and access the different forms of capital that she may need to create the investment opportunities?
Thanks, Marion. And just before I answer the question, I would just like to very quickly welcome everybody also on behalf of the EIT Climate-KIC governing board, and thanks Kirsten, the whole team, for organizing this fascinating conference. It's really cool to have this here in Dublin. Now, as for those projects and scaling up, I think the 3 projects are great also because they're in similar fields. And by the way, what we should have told you is that you might not have seen this, but your app is linked to your bank account. So many thanks for all these contributions. Thank you very much. Scaling up indeed is an important question. And at South Pole, for those of you who don't know us, we have been out there for the past 12 years. And we have about 700 projects in our portfolio in all kinds of sectors, serving around 3,000 corporates and governments. And one thing is very important, and it adds on what Paul mentioned, and also the Fiji case. Energy projects, to finance energy projects, is a very different story to financing a landscape project. And it's not only about the scale, it's predominantly also about the complexity. And that's would be my first point also for Fiji. One thing which I find important is that we are creating the link between why and how exactly do those projects actually basically transform the landscape on a broader scale. If we are able to do that, we could add one element to the pot where those 2 gentlemen have presented their financial instruments, such as grants and loans and equity, which is so-called payments for ecosystem services. Because one way or the other, if you think about it, I've been to so many landscape conferences, and net, if it comes to commercial investments, typically we're talking about sustainable timber at scale, perhaps sustainable fishery, and perhaps ecotourism at scale. Those are the deals that you can just outright finance with classic instruments. In most other cases, to be very honest, if you don't have any value and any pricing on the environmental benefit, and I'm not calling it a carbon credit, it could be called differently, but the environmental benefit, if it's not quantified, the deal it's kind of not flowing. But if you have some kind of environmental payment, we're talking about a different game. And let me give you one concrete example to illustrate that point. Australia, of all places. The Australian government is a $2.5 billion fund, of which my company, through our subsidiary Climate Friendly, happens to have 500 million in terms of contracts. So we have 500 million in terms of contracts, which we can give to farmers who change the way they farm. That is, I won't go in detail, there's different things, but it could be a similar story to the Fiji Islands. And what now happened was that in the past only 3 years, our company alone was able to contract farmers which have farmland the size of Ireland in 3 years. And so this gives me hope that, and one thing I should mention, the price there is a price tag of about 10 to 12 Australian dollars in terms of carbon finance. That was sufficient to turn that around. So what I'm trying to say is, of course, we have a big challenge ahead of us. It's really massive. Paul mentioned it, 24% greenhouse gas emissions are from farmland. Deforestation is a big thing. But with a decent price, one way or the other, which is not massive, we're talking about a couple of dollars, we have a fair chance to go quite far in actually providing one other instrument that would help these guys to unlock more capital at scale.
Yeah, thanks, Renat. That's a really interesting point because it's really connecting the issue that some of those projects may not have the risk-return profile needed for investment to flow at scale, and connecting that directly to a solution that's actually tested, putting a price on carbon or putting a price on a positive externalities, and using that to enhance the risk-return profile of some of those projects. So I'd like to turn back to the two of you now for a couple of questions on your next steps. And so maybe starting with you, Paul, and jumping off the key message from Renat. Payment for ecosystem services and pricing positive externalities can be a powerful tool to enhance the risk profile of some of the landscape investment opportunities you're working on. Is this something that you are focusing on? Is this something that you're working on with partners and which you think can really help accelerate and scale the level of finance that you will be accessing?
It is, and perhaps we can go back to the Fiji slide. Yeah. The challenge is how to take these remarkable opportunities and multiply them again and again across the Fiji landscape and seascape. So the agricultural world in Fiji at the moment is largely sugarcane and lots of very poor farmers. So how can we make the farmers richer, turn their operations organic and replace the sugarcane? And how can we do that with forestry as well? The red world, if you know it, the forest climate world has invested in Fiji. There is a national structure there that has some test cases, and there's $50 million, up to $50 million of finance available to be drawn down into communities who want to replant forests or restore their agriculture to something that saves more carbon. So how do we create a finance system that allows them to access that and to get results at scale? How do we create a finance system, more a training and support system that helps generate more projects like the ones that Jodi is presenting and builds them over time? A landscape program is a 10-year enterprise, so we can start thinking about long-term building capacity and training people, building financial incentive systems that will draw people along, and that's the value of the landscape. Yeah. The landscape approach is that it can create that top layer while there's a whole lot of action going on at the layer below.
I think the struggle that we have right now, and I have Kora Pacific and Bulabatiki, or part of them in the audience.
Stand up, guys.
The struggle that we have is that the money that is available to us now is incredibly cumbersome and frustrating to access, and it's usually tiny amounts. And we want to be putting our efforts into our business and helping the communities we're working with actually develop the business skills, not like busting our guts and just having the worst time accessing this money. And the other issue with the money is that it never comes on time, or it comes with conditions that as private businesses we can't meet those conditions. So for us, we're looking for what are other opportunities for private sector businesses we're baby businesses, but we do have growth potential, and we need to be understood in that framework rather than an NGO or government aid funded framework. And we can't take aid money anymore. I mean, we've got most of the developing world dependent on handouts. That has to change.
And building on that, maybe also picking a couple of questions from Slido. Are there any accelerators or startup incubators in Fiji that you could work with? And then going back to the question on price on carbon that came from Slido, but also reacting to some of the points from Paul on payment for ecosystem services, or reframing the incentive to encourage sort of sustainable practices. Is there any willingness from the government, because it has to come from the government? The example from Renat was clearly government-driven in Australia. Is there any willingness from the government to engage on those issues?
First question, are there any incubators or accelerators? No. We're starting to see some come into the country with impact investment, but there's been one in the last 2 years. One of the reasons I set up the Earth Care Agency, so I was brought over to Fiji to turn around a failing chemical farm and turned it into an organic, certified global gap-winning organic turmeric and ginger farm. During my time there, I saw how difficult it was for smallholder farmers. So really, I set the business up to basically provide these sorts of services, but frankly, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm learning it as I go along. So there is a desperate need there. So right now, we cover things like compliance. That's one of the major barriers to entry. Smallholders cannot get into international markets because they're not third-party certified, organic or food safety. Another is in the area of packaging. There are no services for decent design. There's no marketing. So these are some of the gaps that we're trying to fill. Sorry.
And from the government side, the most excitement we got was for this idea was from the Reserve Bank of Fiji, would you believe? They came back from a conference on sustainable finance, decided that they were going to transform the Fijian banking sector and through that the economy of Fiji to be sustainable, but had no idea how to do it. And so they were part of the team that put this together, and they're really excited to make this happen. And 4 other departments are quite deeply engaged. But it's working out how to do it that's the hard thing, because we're bridging very different worlds, finance, industry, NGOs, communities.
Great, thanks, Paul and Jodi, for those additional elements on the situation in Fiji. I'd like to turn back to my investors colleague and starting with you, Florian. We heard quite a bit about the situation in Fiji, some of the challenges, some of the early stage solutions that are starting to emerge. But the message from Jodi is also accessing finance is just not possible. It's either not the right type of finance, we don't want grants, we want sort of commercial finance, but it's not available or not on the right terms. With your experience, Florian, is there a solution that you've used in the past, or a tool or an approach that is tested and that worked somewhere else that you think could apply to the Fiji case and help Jodi and other members of the community and entrepreneurs in Fiji access finance?
Well, it's like John said next to me, it's not really the finance that's lacking, but it's the intermediaries that bring finance down to where it's needed. I was just at the Gin in Paris last week, and it's mind-blowing what kind of sums are now flowing into impact funds. Sometimes, I think, on the wrong premises, but there is a lot of money out there. It's going to seek for projects, and it won't find them. It's seeking for 100 million tickets, and it won't find them. And I think it's on us. We're kind of in between. We're running a fund that could probably also not do less than $500,000 or $1 million in a particular investment. And as I said, geographically is restricted because it's a public-private partnership, so we cannot go anywhere we like. But it's going to not be the funds like we'd run them, but it's going to be maybe a fund below us, and then a venture capitalist, and then an accelerator below us. But to build all that chain, I know it's a huge challenge, and it requires some public regulatory support, some grant funding, and patience, which we don't have and shouldn't have.
Thanks, Florian. So Jodi, on the same topic, is this something that SailVentures can do, like work with intermediaries to make sure that you can access smaller size opportunities?
Yeah, no, it's something we actually in Peru. It's a country where we've, in looking through the markets that we're trying to influence because they're drivers of deforestation, the supply chain, whittles down to very small actors fast, and it maybe is a little bit similar. I mean, Peru is quite different to Fiji, but what we're looking at there is actually we're having discussions with the banking sector to see if we can structure, and I know Finance in Motion is also very good at this, structure a green line, so financing to a bank with very specific criteria as to who can fit into our bucket of finance that we provide the bank and the conditions to that. That would work well here, depending on how flexible the banks are. I mean, banks are typically the last ones to innovate, and in small countries like this, I found that a lot in Africa. The banks are not actually ready to move away from their vanilla products, and often their lenders won't allow them to. But banks are an option. The other one is actually the supply chain. So your traders, your international trader, comes back to my question about the market and comparative advantage. If you can attract an international trader, or so the market, towards Fiji, that's an interesting entry point for an investor like us. We could risk share with a trader to finance a group of some of these projects, and there's a clear link for them there. I mean, the finance is just an add-on for them, for a way for them to get the product. For us, it's interesting because they're professional, they can screen the right farmers, they can build a portfolio that's credible. So we look at those two avenues, and in a number of places around the world, we are using that to, down the line, as you said, the fund to fund, down the line, a farmer is getting a couple of $100 sometimes. It's possible, absolutely. Yeah.
And Renat, now turning to you and focusing again on the solution side of the equation. Anything you'd like to add or recommend to Paul and Jodi as they move forward in their journey?
Yes, I think what we have seen also from these two sides of the panel is that this mismatch, right? It's a common problem. And finance, I may sound a bit simplistic here, but essentially, if you want to know where finance is flowing, look at three things: return, risk, and scale. Return is high, risk is low, scale is high, money is flowing. If not, money is not flowing. Quite simple. So what we have to do in the case of Fiji, increase returns, reduce risks, and decrease scale. And just one idea how this could unfold, and I think we can include the whole panel, and we should after this session have a follow-up session to do that. Let me start by saying the Swiss government, for example, has a program under the Paris Agreement to actually engage in other places to meet its Paris pledge. This means that the country is currently looking for partner countries on the government-to-government level to basically identify larger scale deals they could finance. We could, for example, start by connecting the Fiji government there, and find out whether we could create a program that covers the entire industry of manufacturing consumer goods such as the oils, and see whether we could basically create a system that would cover not only the tree, but everybody on the Fiji Islands, and see whether we can...
I'm going to be bold and say that it couldn't be government.
I think if there is money around, there's always...
We won't see it. We won't see it. It's what's been happening with aid money, and there's no auditing of it. It just disappears.
But I'm not finished. Wait a second. So that's just the start. So, and by the way, the money we're making. Good point. By the way, we create a situation, and here I look at Marion as well at the gold standard. We create a certification system which allows all government officials, please don't listen. We create a system that tries to bypass the governments by actually having a Fijian foundation or whatever we create with you guys all on the board, and we're ensuring that the government of Switzerland is happy to actually basically have the approval from the Fiji government, but the money goes to the foundation. So now the money is flowing per hectare or acre of land we were able to basically now farm in a more sustainable way. Now, because we have now this guarantee which comes in euro or dollars, which is a currency these guys like, we might be able to unlock or leverage a loan from one of you to loan against that, and you have a partial guarantee through that foundation, which carries the Swiss AAA balance sheet in the background. So perhaps with that structure, where we could then draw down for the farmers, we may have a deal. And on top, we're doing one more thing with the gold standard. We're creating a certification system for Scope 3 accounting for corporates, so that we have some through CDP. We create some pushing that. Corporates who buy goods, they need to do that in a zero deforestation clean way, and we're going to leverage some additional money through that. So I think by this we have everybody involved. Right. I mean, it's not that simple perhaps, but I think there is ways, and all these elements have been done in the past. Okay, so it's not, nothing of this is new. All these elements have been done. We have to put them together and make them.
Thanks, Renat. That's a really.
One quick thing on that.
I just want to clarify first that the point Renat is making is super interesting. It's also shedding light on who could be the buyers or the financiers of the external, of the positive externalities that we could quantify and certify. So that's building on the previous discussion on enhancing the risk, the return profile. We actually have governments under the Paris Agreement that are ready to pay for carbon outcomes, and we also have corporates in the private sector world that are ready to pay for lower carbon goods. So we have here the demand side that can enhance the return profile of those opportunities. But Jodi, please go forward.
No, just one short comment is just, I mean, in Africa we've had some successful challenge funds which have worked, to your point of bureaucracy, they've worked well because essentially an accounting firm has just run a very straightforward black box proposal. If you win, you get X amount of essentially free equity, which is says grant, and they link that to your ability to raise capital from the banks, because it's going to be coming. So there are, I mean, it's a little bit to what you said earlier, Florian. There's some grant money that's needed in these examples before, in my view at least, before other investors, more commercial investors, can come on board.
Yeah,
so
two smaller projects. That's exactly how we've put them together. Yeah.
Maybe I can add on this point. Our funds, besides being blended in the actual capital stock, they also have a TA facility, technical assistance facility, in parallel, which we can use exactly for this kind of early stage building, strengthening a project proposal. Still, we are going to not be able in that small scale to play and geographically, but that's very important for our success of investment.
Thanks, Florian. And we're unfortunately reaching the end of our session. For the last comment, I'd like to ask Paul to give us a very succinct, maybe 1 or 2 sentences, a vision of where you see the Landscape Finance Lab in a few years from now, and how does this lab sort of fit into the ecosystem and help solve some of the challenges that we talked about and bring some of the solutions to the market.
Thanks, Marion, and I mean, thanks everyone. This is a real test case for all landscapes on Earth, and I think the Landscape Finance Lab is set up by WWF, but will spin off and will be owned by other organisations jointly. It'll be available as a space to generate these sorts of landscape finance programs. And it's an experimental space. I think someone on Twitter said, do we have to play by the market rules? Can't we write the rules ourselves? And I think you can see in this conversation we can write the rules. We can write new rules. This is really exciting stuff. And when you think about the big picture, the world has about 1,000 landscapes, depending on how you look at it. There's 780 eco-regions, there's about 1,000 river systems, there's about 1,000 small countries and provinces of large countries. And actually, the problems sit in only a few of those landscapes. 13 of them are the sources of emissions from forest clearance. There's 35 primary ecoregions where most of the biodiversity lives. And so it goes on, freshwater and poverty and. We only have to do about 100 of these landscape programs to address the SDGs. So that's not impossible. And each one of those costs about the same as a jet fighter. And the whole lot together, 100 of them, costs about as much as an aircraft carrier, or half of a bridge between Hong Kong and Macau. There is no reason why we can't do that, and we've got 11 harvests to get it done in, and we've got to get a lot of avocado and coconut oil out into the world to make this happen.
Great, thanks.
So join us.
Join us, let's do it, and please thank you everyone for your contributions, and looking forward to engaging with all of you, Climate-KIC and all other partners on this journey forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion.